We're getting there. Okay. Do you want to start the slideshow?
Yeah, you see it now?
Perfect. Go for it.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you for inviting me to this very important workshop. I have actually attended most of the panels in the past 2 days and found them very interesting. The purpose of this panel is to discuss the question, what can developers of new and advanced reactors learn from nuclear waste siting? And I want to argue that they can in fact learn quite a lot. For more than half a century, nuclear waste has been seen as the Achilles heel of nuclear power. Critics have argued that it is deeply immoral to build nuclear power stations before a reliable method for taking care of the waste has been developed. Moreover, when the nuclear industry has tried to identify suitable places for repositories for nuclear waste, they have often met strong local resistance. Yucca Mountain is well known in the US, and there are many similar places in Europe. In most countries with nuclear power, there is at present something of a deadlock when it comes to building repositories for nuclear waste. This means that the quantities of nuclear waste situated in temporary storage facilities is steadily growing. The Achilles heel of nuclear energy is thus more vulnerable than ever. The many countries that have failed even to come close to building a repository may provide developers of new and advanced reactors ample experience of what not to do. I will, however, not delve into such negative lessons, but instead try to identify positive lessons from the few countries that have come a long way towards building a repository. The only country in the world in which a repository is actually under construction is Finland. The design of its repository has largely been made in Sweden, and Sweden too has come far towards a repository. What these countries have in common is that the nuclear industry has been able to gain a certain degree of trust when it comes to managing nuclear waste. In my paper, I will focus on how this trust has been gradually built up in Sweden. Sweden has had one of the most ambitious nuclear programs in the world per capita. Initially, it had double civilian and military aims and received massive public funding. However, this ambitious program triggered a growing anti-nuclear movement in Sweden from the early 1970s. And one of its core arguments was that there was no solution for how to handle the spent nuclear fuel. Nuclear power was a hot political issue in the general election in 1976. It led to the formation of a three-party coalition with one party opposing nuclear power and two parties in favor. These parties had very different views on the future of nuclear power, and a compromise was the adoption of a new law, the Nucle Stipulation Act. This act stipulated that reactor owners had to demonstrate that they would be able to handle the spent fuel from their reactors in a totally safe way to get permission to commission new reactors. This act spurred the Swedish nuclear power companies to pursue an intensive research project designed to come up with a convincing method for final disposal of spent fuel. Within 2 years, they presented their proposal in which the spent fuel is to be placed in copper canisters that are stored in deep rock caverns surrounded by bentonite clay. On April 27, 1979, the regulating agency approved the method and thus also the commissioning of additional reactors. However, the day after this decision, the 3 Mile Island accident occurred, which spurred anti-nuclear sentiments in Sweden and elsewhere. To cope with them, a referendum on the future of nuclear power was held in March 1980. It resulted in a compromise, a decision to use the 12 reactors that were completed or under construction, but to phase out all these reactors by This phase-out was later postponed, and even if 6 out of 12 reactors have been decommissioned, nuclear power still provides almost 40% of Sweden's electricity. In the first half of the 1980s, the broader principles for how to handle nuclear waste were gradually implemented. It resulted in a socio-technical system with 5 key components. The first has to do with legislation. It clarifies that the companies owning nuclear reactors are responsible for managing nuclear waste, and that government agencies shall regulate and monitor them. In 1998, a new environmental law was adopted stating that also the Land and Environment Court shall assess nuclear waste plants. The second component concerns financing. All reactor owners have to pay a certain amount for every produced kilowatt hour to a state nuclear waste fund. The third is the organizational setup. The nuclear power companies established a joint company, SKB, which is the implementing entity for handling nuclear waste. Several government agencies are monitoring SKB's work. The fourth is the design and construction of the various facilities needed. This is the task of SKB, and its work is financed by the Nuclear Waste Fund. The fifth, finally, has to do with siting, that is, finding suitable locations for all the facilities needed. The key designers of the Swedish nuclear waste system were engineers and scientists, and from the very start they had a technocratic approach. This became obvious in the way SKB went about to identify places for a repository in the early 1980s. They sent out drilling teams to a number of places that seemed to provide optimal geological conditions, but they did so without informing the local communities beforehand. These drilling teams met strong local opposition, as you can see. The Minister of Energy, Birgitta Dahl, was unhappy about SKB's narrow technocratic approach. In 1985, she established a small advisory body to the Swedish government on nuclear waste called KASAM. The purpose of KASAM was to widen the perspective on nuclear waste and to create a forum for discussion and reflection on nuclear waste issues. KASAM soon developed into a nexus where the hardcore engineers and scientists could meet and discuss with scholars from social science and humanities. The most important instrument in KASAM's toolbox were annual workshops on important topics such as ethics, radioactive waste and uncertainty, public acceptance, tolerance and participation, and decision-making under uncertainty. These workshops lasted for 2 or 3 days, attracting some 50 participants. On the one hand, representatives from the regulators and the implementer SKB, and on the other hand, researchers with expertise in the questions discussed at the respective workshops. The workshops provided opportunities for informal, sincere discussions among people with different roles in the nuclear waste system, and to a gradual transformation of their technocratic approach in a broader and more reflective direction. After the massive local opposition to drilling in many municipalities in the early 1980s, SKB adopted a new siting strategy in the early 1990s, in which approval from the local population was essential. SKB now emphasized that geology provided only one of the barriers in a repository, besides copper canisters and bentonite clay. It started arguing that it was not necessary to search for the best possible geological location in the whole country, but that the geology in large parts of Sweden was in fact sufficiently good. SKB approached a number of municipalities, but in almost all of them the local populations were not willing to host a repository in the end. But finally, SKB chose 2 municipalities, which already hosted nuclear plants as main candidates for the final repository. In these municipalities, Östhammar and Oskarshamn, the nuclear power plants had for a long time been large employers. The local population, as well as local politicians, trusted the nuclear industry and were eager to host the repository. SKB and KSAM arranged a number of meetings and consultations with local stakeholders in both places to inform them about how the repository would be built. In the spring of 2011, after more than 40 years of preparations, SKB submitted a formal license application, including an encapsulation plant in Oskarshamn and a deep geological repository in Östhammar. This application was carefully examined by the safety regulator and by the Land and Environment Court. Civil society and academia also played an important role in the examination. In fact, 2 anti-nuclear organizations received financial support from the Nuclear Waste Fund for developing their critique of SKB's application. Moreover, corrosion researchers at my university, the Royal Institute of Technology, seriously questioned the durability of the copper canisters. The Land and Environment Court arranged a 5-week public hearing in the fall of 2017, during which all the relevant actors participated and they visited the places where the facilities would be located. I was present at the final day of this hearing, and I found it impressive that representatives from the nuclear industry, regulating authorities, regional and local communities, critical researchers, and environmental organizations were all given the opportunity to present their final statements. The court listened carefully to all these statements, and in particular to the critical corrosion researchers from our university. In its decision 3 months later, it is actually almost 600 pages long, this decision, the court gave conditional support to the application, requiring that SKB make further investigations on the durability of the copper canisters. 1 week ago, the Swedish government was expected to announce its final decision about SKB's application. However, it announced that it is still not satisfied with SKB's research on the durability of the canister. And this has made the nuclear industry and SKB quite upset. It is at present putting hard pressure on the government to reverse its decision. Let me now summarize. In my opinion, the Swedish handling of the nuclear waste issue demonstrates that in order to develop a technological system that is potentially very dangerous and thus contested by many, it is crucial to organize a process that is characterized by transparency and allowing all relevant actors to make their voices heard. Or to put it more succinct, for developers of contested technologies to earn trust, they first have to encourage informed mistrust. How can this be applied to the development of new and advanced nuclear reactors in the United States? What can be learned? First, I believe that it is essential to broaden the technocratic approach that is still dominant in the nuclear industry. Maybe your committee could play a similar role as KASAM did in Sweden. A task for you could be to organize workshops at which scientists and engineers developing and regulating new reactors discuss broader societal issues at some depth. Moreover, I suggest that, like in Sweden, also environmental organizations and researchers skeptical of new reactors should be able to get public funding. The purpose of this would be to help identify problems and dilemmas with the new technology at an early stage. It is also crucial that formal hearings are organized at which all the relevant actors are able to present their views. This is a way of earning trust by encouraging informed mistrust. Finally, there is a direct link between new reactors and the issue of nuclear waste. New reactors will produce additional spent nuclear fuel. Your committee could urge that the US adopts a law of a similar kind as the Swedish Nucle Stipulation Act from 1977. That is, a law that stipulates that no new reactors are allowed to be commissioned unless their owners can demonstrate not only a trustworthy method for how to build a repository, but also a suitable place for it, where the local population is in favor of such a plant. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Arne. That was excellent. That was very clear.